12,000 years ago, the problem wasn't survival, it was space. As the ice melted, oceans rose. Coastlines moved inland year after year. Entire hunting grounds vanished beneath water within a single lifetime. Humans didn't stop moving because they found a better way to live. They stopped because there was less land to move into. When the world was wide, humans wandered. When the world began to shrink, wandering stopped. 12,000 years ago, the problem facing humans was not intelligence, technology, or ambition. It was space for most of their existence. Humans had survived by moving. When resources thinned, they followed animals. Distance absorbed failure. The world was wide enough that mistakes could be left behind, that logic worked as long as land remained stable. It stopped working when the land itself began to vanish. As the climate warmed, ice sheets that had locked away water for tens of thousands of years began to melt. The melt did not happen all at once, but it did not reverse. Each year added more water to the oceans. Coastlines moved inland steadily, not as a single catastrophe, but as a continuous retreat. Lowlands disappeared first, river deltas flooded, plains that had supported herds and camps were lost beneath shallow seas. The key pressure was simple. There was less land available every generation. Humans responded the only way they knew how. They moved. Camps were shifted inland, routes were adjusted. For a time this worked, but moving farther now meant crowding into the same remaining spaces. Migration corridors narrowed, areas that had once been empty buffers between groups vanished underwater. What had been wide, forgiving geography became compressed. This compression mattered because movement relies on surplus space ahead. When the land ahead shrinks faster than you can reach it, movement no longer solves risk. It concentrated. Within a few thousand years, entire regions that had supported human life were gone. Continental shelves were submerged. Land bridges that once connected continents disappeared. These were not marginal zones. They were some of the richest ecosystem humans had ever used. Their loss removed options permanently. Once submerged, they could not be returned to. This is the first critical constraint. The exit routes that had always existed were physically erased. As land vanished, the cost of moving rose. Groups encountered each other more frequently because there were fewer places to disperse into. Avoidance became difficult. Conflict became more expensive because losing access to land now meant losing irreplaceable territory. Migration no longer reduced pressure. It intensified. The animals humans had relied on began to thin out. Large herds require large ranges. As habitat fragmented and shrank, megafauna populations declined. Hunting became less predictable, more dangerous and less rewarding. This mattered because hunting large animals had supported mobility. A single kill could sustain movement for weeks. As these animals disappeared, humans were forced to rely more on smaller low-cost resources: fish, shellfish, plants. They required staying near them long enough to exploit seasonal cycles. This was not a preference. It was a response to losing mobile food sources at the same time as losing mobile land. At this point, movement failed for two reasons at once. First, there was less land to move into. Second, the resources that supported movement were disappearing. Together, these pressures forced longer stays in the same places. Camps remained occupied across multiple seasons, not because people planned to settle, but because leaving no longer improved survival odds. Staying became the least risky option available. As people stayed longer, knowledge of specific places became more valuable. Which areas flooded first? This knowledge only mattered if you stayed nearby to use it. That created a feedback loop. Staying increased the value of local knowledge. Local knowledge made staying more effective. This loop existed only because land loss had already removed the alternative. Of moving on, storage followed naturally. When movement slows, carrying everything becomes inefficient. Food that cannot be eaten immediately must be kept. Storage ties people to place because stored resources cannot be moved easily. This was not a strategy chosen in advance. It was a practical response to having fewer places to go. The moment food was stored, leaving became costly. The loss of land had turned staying into an investment. As more people stayed in the same areas, pressure intensified further. Some locations were better than others. Slightly higher ground, more reliable water, richer soil. Access to these places mattered enormously because alternatives had already been submerged. Competition for space increased. Boundaries formed, not as political contests but as survival necessities. Scarcity does not need ideality to create inequality. It only needs immobility. This is where settlement emerges, not as a goal but as a residue. Humans did not decide to build permanent lives and then stop moving. They stopped moving because the world no longer allowed movement to function as a solution. Villages formed because people were already staying. Agriculture developed because people were already tied to specific plots of land. These outcomes trace directly back to the same cause. Rising water removed space faster than humans could relocate. Every step in this sequence depends on land loss. Without submerged coastlines, migration would have continued. Without vanished land bridges, dispersal would have remained possible. Without shrinking habitats, megafauna would have remained viable. Without these pressures, staying would not have been safer than leaving. Settlement was not an invention. It was what remained when escape was no longer available. By the time humans began farming deliberately, the decision space had already collapsed. The world had narrowed. Staying was no longer a choice among many. It was the only option left that did not immediately increase risk. Civilization begins here, not as progress, but as adaptation to a world that had physically removed the paths humans had always used to survive. This is why settlement spreads unevenly and slowly. It appears only where land loss has already trapped people long enough to make leaving dangerous, where coastlines retreat, where corridors close, where herds fail, staying hardens into habit. Civilization does not arrive everywhere at once. It forms precisely where rising water and disappearing land have already erased every other viable way to survive, leaving permanence as the least risky response available. This uneven spread matters because it proves settlement was not driven by a universal desire to change, but by localized pressure where land disappeared fastest. In regions where coastlines remained stable and open space persisted, mobility continued longer. Where rising water cut off plains, drowned deltas, and sealed land bridges, movement failed earlier. The same species behaved differently under different spatial constraints. This traces back to geography by culture as an option. As sea levels rose, remaining habitable land did not just shrink in area. It fractured. Continuous landscapes broke into isolated zones separated by water, mountains or other groups competing for the same ground. Fragmentation matters because movement depends on continuity. A wide plain can absorb migration. When corridors close, people stop thinking in terms of routes and start thinking in terms of boundaries. Boundaries emerge, not because humans suddenly value ownership, but because access determines survival when space is scarce. This scarcity changes how decisions are evaluated. When land is abundant, a failed choice can be corrected by leaving. When land is limited, failure must be prevented. Prevention favors control over exploration. Control favors repetition over experimentation. These preferences only make sense once land loss has removed the safety net of distance. Without that loss, staying still would remain unnecessary and risky. The shift toward managing specific low remains necessary. Population density increases, not because birth rates rise immediately, but because fewer places remain to spread into rising seas, compress humanity into smaller zones. Compression amplifies every interaction. Resource use becomes visible. Overuse becomes noticeable in patterns. Species dies. The land no longer offers relief elsewhere. At this stage, time begins to matter differently. When people move freely, time is measured by travel and season. When people are forced to stay, time is measured by return. When will the water recede? When will plants regrow? When will fish return? These cycles matter only if you remain near them. This is another feedback loop driven by land loss. Staying makes cycles visible. Visible cycles reward staying. The more reliable these cycles become, the more dangerous leaving feels. Deliberate cultivation emerges within this constraint. Encouraging certain plants to grow where you already are makes sense only when moving on is no longer viable. It is a response to being pinned to shrinking ground when the land you depend on cannot be replaced. Increasing its yield becomes logical. Control over growth replaces pursuit of abundance elsewhere. This replacement happens slowly, unevenly, and only where land loss has already removed. Alternatives, the same logic applies to animals. Herb management, domestication, and controlled breeding appear where wild resources have become unreliable due to habitat loss. Again, the cause is not foresight, it is restriction. When space collapses, predictability becomes more valuable than scale. Smaller, controlled food sources replace larger mobile ones. Each of these developments reinforces the same outcome. Staying produces investment. Investment increases dependence. Dependence raises the cost of leaving. Leaving becomes increasingly unthinkable, not because land loss has already made movement dangerous. What looks like commitment is often just constraint accumulated over time. By this point, settlement sustains itself. Even if environmental conditions stabilize temporarily, the structures built to manage scarcity remain. People have fewer skills for long-distance movement, tools are heavier, knowledge is localized, social organization assumes proximity. The land that once allowed escape no longer exists, and neither does the way of life built around it. This is why the transition does not reverse. Once rising water removes enough land, the behaviors it forces persist. Long after the water stops rising, the cause disappears, but the effects remain. Humans do not continue settling because it is optimal in all conditions. They continue because the disappearance of land has already eliminated the conditions under which wandering made sense. It is the long shadow cast by a world that physically took away the ground beneath humanity's oldest solution. That shadow explains why later generations inherit settlement. As if it were natural, by the time farming villages spread, no one living remembers a world wide enough to walk away from failure. The coastlines have stabilized in new positions. The drowned plains are stories without coordinates. The pressure that forced staying has faded from view, but its consequences remain embedded in behavior. People organize life around fixed ground because fixed ground is all that exists. This is not tradition choosing itself. It is adaptation outliving its cause. The loss of land does not need to continue for settlement to persist. Once enough people are tied to enough places, movement stops being a solution, even in theory. Leaving means abandoning stored food, cleared ground, social agreements, and accumulated knowledge. Those costs only exist because rising water removed alternates. Illyri, settlement endures because land loss made it necessary long enough for permanence to take root. This is the critical correction to the common story. Humans did not settle because they discovered a better way to live. They settled because the environment eliminated the old way faster than they could adapt it. Rising seas did not teach humans how to farm. They took away the space that made wandering viable. Everything that followed grew inside that constraint. Whenever land disappears faster than people can relocate, the same pattern repeats. Mobility fails. Staying becomes safer than leaving. Investment replaces movement. Boundaries replace roots. What we call civilization is not a leap forward, but the shape life takes when escape is no longer possible. The first villages were not built in moments of confidence, but in moments where the ground itself had already closed every other path forward. That pattern matters because it means settlement is not tied to a single place or era. It is a response that appears whenever land loss removes mobility as a viable strategy. In the deep past rising seas, drowned coasts and corridors, in each affected region, the same logic applied. When the ground ahead vanished, walking stopped solving problems. Staying did. This is why early settlements cluster near shrinking shorelines, river mouths, and constrained valleys. These were not ideal locations chosen for comfort. They were traps created by geography, where land loss forced people to remain long enough for permanence to form. Once people are held in place by disappearing land, every decision tightens the bind. Clearing a field makes sense only if you will still be there to harvest it. Building a heavier shelter makes sense only if leaving has already become dangerous. Teaching children local cycles matters only if those cycles will still govern their lives. Each action assumes the loss of alternatives. Each assumption deepens dependence on the same shrinking ground. Settlement grows not because people want roots, but because roots reduce risk. This is why the shift feels gradual rather than abrupt. No one wakes up and decides to abandon wandering erodes quietly as land disappears. Roots fail one by one, resource thin, conflicts rise. Staying extends by necessity. What looks like slow cultural change is actually a fast environment enough to be normalized. By the time settlement is visible, mobility has already collapsed. The central cause never changes. Ice melts, water rises, land vanishes, options close, humans adapt inward, remove the land loss and the chain breaks, leave it in place and the outcome repeats this civilization. At its origin is not an achievement discovered by choice. It is the residue left when the world removes the space needed to keep moving, and forces humanity to survive by staying where the ground has not yet disappeared. This causal chain also explains why settlement develops pressure points rather than stability at first. When land loss pins people in place, the remaining ground is rarely ideal. It is whatever has not yet disappeared. Floodplains are unstable, river mouths shift, coasty edges erode. These places are chosen not because they are safe, but because they are what remains when escape routes are gone. Humans adapt to them because they must, not because they offer comfort. This is why early settled life is fragile. Salinity ruins soil, storms wipe out shelters. Yet leaving still carries greater risk, because there is nowhere better to go. Land loss has already removed the margin that would make relocating safer than rebuilding. As pressure increases, people are forced to reduce uncertainty wherever they can. They cannot control rising water, but they can control behavior. They can decide when to plant, when to harvest. Who has access to which areas control becomes a substitute for space. The less land remains, the more behavior must be regulated to prevent collapse. This regulation is not abstract, it is directly tied to the fact that land cannot absorb mistakes anymore. Overusing a patch of ground matters when there is no alternative patch to move into. Overfishing a bay matters when the next bay is already occupied or submerged. Scarcity sharpens consequences. Consequences force rules. These rules only emerge because movement has failed in a wide world. Rules can be escaped by leaving in a shrinking world. They must be negotiated. Negotiation requires staying close. Staying close increases dependence. Dependence encourages enforcement. Enforcement stabilizes patterns. Every step in this sequence points back to the same origin. Land has disappeared faster than people can relocate. As settlement deepens, population grows within constrained space. Children who would have grown up elsewhere now remain near where they were born. Density rises even if numbers do not. Density magnifies every pressure. Waste accumulates. Disease spreads more easily. Rust depletion accelerates. These are not side effects of civilization. They are direct outcomes of people being forced to stay where land loss has already removed. Again, the response is inward. People alter diets. They intensify cultivation. They manage waste. They adjust living arrangements. Each adjustment increases efficiency within limited space. Each efficiency improvement reduces the immediate need to leave. Reduced need reinforces staying. The loop tightens, settlement becomes self-sustaining because land loss has already eliminated the conditions. This is why returning to wandering is not a realistic option. Once settlement passes a certain threshold, even if environmental conditions improve temporarily, the landscape is no longer continuous. It is divided by other settlements, altered ecosystem, and managed ground. The physical space required for large-scale movement has been removed permanently. They rearranged what remained into disconnected fragments. Fragmentation makes mobility dangerous, even if climate stabilizes. The old routes are gone, new ones are blocked. At this stage, settlement appears inevitable, but inevitability is retrospective from within the process. It feels like constant adaptation to worsening conditions. They feel they are preventing failure one season at a time. Farming intensifies because hunting no longer provides enough return in fragmented habitats. Storage expands because bad seasons cannot be escaped. Architecture becomes heavier because storms cannot be outrun. Every feature associated with early civilization traces back to the same constraint: land loss removed mobility. Understanding this matters because it reframes what civilization is. It is not the result of surplus created by innovation. It is the structure that forms when surplus space disappears. Immorumation follows constraint, not the other way around. Humans did not innovate in order to settle. They settled because the land that allowed movement was gone, and innovation was required to survive in place. This also explains why early civilizations are so vulnerable to environmental shocks. They are built in response to land loss, not abundance. They operate near limits from the beginning. Floods, droughts, and salinization hit hard because there is no spare land to buffer. Failure, collapse is not an anomaly. It is a risk inherent in systems built under spatial constraint. When the same forces that remove land continue or intensify, settlement systems strain. When they ease, systems persist because reversal requires space that no longer exists. The central question remains constant throughout this entire process. Why did humans stop wandering? Because wandering depended on land that no longer existed. Why did they settle? Because staying became less dangerous than leaving once land vanished faster than people could move. Every layer of early civilization grows from that root. Remove the root, and the structure does not fall. Leave it in place, and the outcome repeats across regions and eras. Settlement is not humanity choosing permanence. It is humanity adapting to a world that has physically closed its exits. The loss of land did not simply change where people lived, it changed what strategies were possible. When the ground disappears, movement fails. When movement fails, everything else follows from that single narrowing fact, repeated quietly until it shapes history itself. That narrowing fact also explains why settlement spreads pressure forward through time. Once humans adapt to land loss by staying, the solution creates new dependencies that assume land will not be regained. Fields require seasons, storage requires protection, social agreements require continuity. None of these function if movement resumes. This is why settlement locks in so quickly. Once land loss crosses a threshold, the response is reversible only while movement still works. After that point, reversal becomes more dangerous than continuation. Land loss therefore operates like a one-way gate. As long as people can still move into empty space, wandering remains viable. Once rising water and fragmentation remove that space, staying becomes the least risky option. Every season spent staying raises the cost of leaving. Each generation grows up with fewer skills for long-distance movement and more skills tied to fixed ground. Knowledge becomes local. Tools become heavy. Diets become dependent on managed land. These changes are rational only because land loss has already removed alternatives. This is why early settlements appear fragile yet persistent. They struggle constantly, but they do not disperse. Dispersal would require land that no longer exists. Collapse does not automatically restore wandering because collapse occurs within the same constrained geography. When a village fails, its people do not return to wide migration. They crowd into other settled areas or rebuild in place. The land that once absorbed failure is still gone. Rising seas do not reverse collapse by reopening space. They only tighten pressure. Understanding this sequence corrects a deep misconception. In reality, it is a response to spatial loss. Scarcity becomes dangerous only when movement can no longer relieve it. When land disappears, scarcity becomes local, persistent, and unavoidable. Staying becomes mandatory long before it becomes comfortable. Agriculture, storage, hierarchy, and boundaries emerged not because humans planned them, but because the world no longer allowed the alternative. This is the central answer that must not be lost. Humans stopped wandering because wandering required land that had been physically removed. They settled because the disappearance of land made staying safer than leaving. Everything else, culture, belief, structure, grows downstream of that pressure, without rising water and shrinking ground. With it, civilization became not a choice, but a necessity imposed by a world that quietly erased every other path forward. This necessity reshapes how survival is evaluated across generations. Once land loss removes the option of dispersal, success is no longer measured by finding new territory, but by holding ground that remains. Holding ground becomes the primary objective because losing it cannot be corrected by moving elsewhere. This shifts effort toward defense, maintenance, and control. Defense matters because land is finite, maintenance matters because degraded land cannot be replaced, control matters because uncontrolled use affolonate. Effluent. They arise only after rising water has already erased alternatives. As a result, settlement concentrates around places where land loss has slowed enough to allow continuity, but not enough to allow expansion. These zones are precarious by nature. They exist between what has already been submerged and what remains habitable. Life there is defined by vigilance. Seasonal thresholds are watched closely. Small errors carry disproportionate consequences because the margin for retreat has vanished. Again, this condition traces back to the same origin. Land disappeared faster than people could relocate, because retreat is no longer possible. Innovation becomes defensive rather than exploratory. Techniques aim to stabilize yields rather than expand range. Irrigation appears where rainfall is unreliable, because losing a crop cannot be offset by moving on. Terracing appears where soil erosion threatens, because abandoning land would mean entering already occupied or submerged. Terry's responses are often praised as ingenuity, but their direction is dictated by constraint. They make sense only in a world where land loss has already removed the option of exit. Over time, the accumulation of defensive adaptations creates complexity. Complexity increases. Dependence to function. Coordination requires authority. Authority arises not because people desire hierarchy, but because failure in a constrained system. When land is scarce, mismanagement threatens everyone. Sharing it, concentrating decision-making reduces variance. Reduced variance increases survival. Odds, the logic is mechanical. It depends on the disappearance of land as a safety valve. As authority stabilizes patterns of use, inequality intensifies. Those with better access to stable ground, reduced risk compounds across seasons. Compounding advantage is not an ideological choice. It is the mathematical outcome of operating within fixed space. In a wide world, advantage dissipates through movement. In a shrinking world, advantage accumulates because movement no longer redistributes. Pressure. Rising seas do not create inequality by themselves. The social consequences feed back into settlement. People with fewer options cling more tightly to remaining land. Leaving becomes increasingly costly not just materially, but socially. Agreements, obligations, and roles tie individuals to place. These ties only form because land loss has already removed the freedom to detach. A bad harvest no longer prompts departure, it prompts rationing, redistribution, and control. The response remains inward because outward movement has been physically closed off. This inward focus alters how future risks are perceived. Environmental change is interpreted through the lens of staying. Floods are managed, droughts are mitigated. Rarely is movement considered a solution because the landscape no longer supports it. The memory of a mobile past fades. What remains is a framework mean for persistence under constraint. This framework is effective within certain limits. It fails when change exceeds what local management can absorb. Yet even failure does not restore wandering. It produces collapse within the same confined space. This is why cycles of rise and fall occur within early settled societies, without returning to wide mobility. Collapse does not reopen land, submerged plains remain submerged, fragmented corridors remain blocked, the geography that forced settlement continues to exist. Each recovery therefore rebuilds within the same constraints. Over time, layers of adaptation accumulate. The system grows heavier, more interdependent, more difficult to alter. The cause may recede into the background, but its effect remains active. The persistence of settlement is therefore not evidence that it was optimal. It is evidence that the conditions required to undo it were permanently removed. Land loss does not need to continue for its consequences to persist. Once enough space is gone, the strategies built in response become self-sustaining. They are maintained because abandoning them would require space that no longer exists. This returns the focus to the central question. Why did humans stop wandering? Because wandering depended on excess land ahead. Why did they settle? Because rising water and fragmentation removed that excess faster than people could adapt by moving. The transition was not driven by vision or preference. It was driven by constraint that closed exits one by one, until staying became the least dangerous option available. Civilization emerges from this sequence, not as a triumph, but as a compression. It is what human life looks like when space no longer absorbs failure. Every structure, rule, and innovation associated with early settled life traces back to the same narrowing condition. The ground disappeared, movement failed, staying followed. Everything else is consequence, layered on top of that loss, carried forward because the world that once allowed a different response is no longer there. This framing matters because it removes intention from the story and replaces it with pressure. Humans did not abandon wandering because they outgrew it. They abandoned it because the land that made wandering work was physically removed. When coastlines drowned and corridors closed, movement stopped being a solution. Staying became the least dangerous response, not a desirable one. Every village, field, and boundary that followed was built inside that narrowing reality. Once land loss crosses a threshold, history bends, choice shrink, response convert. Different groups arrive at similar solutions not through imitation but because the environment permits fewer viable paths. Where land remains continuous, wandering persists. Where it disappears, settlement forms. The pattern repeats because the cause repeats. Seen this way, the origin of civilization is not a mystery of human nature. It is a consequence of geography changing faster than mobility could compensate. The ground vanished. With it vanished the option to walk away. What replaced it was not chosen freely. It was assembled out of necessity, one constrained decision at a time, until staying became life itself, and wandering became a memory without a place to return to. Once wandering ceased to function as a reliable response, every remaining strategy had to operate within fixed limits. These limits were not abstract. They were drawn by water lines, by submerged shelves, by drowned corridors that had once allowed people to disperse pressure across space. The loss of land turned geography into a constraint rather than a resource. This shift is what forced humans to reorganize survival around staying, not because staying was efficient, but because leaving no longer reduced risk. Within these limits, even small environmental fluctuations became more dangerous. In a wide world, a bad year could be escaped. In a narrow one, it had to be endured. Rising seas made bad years more frequent by detailizing coastlines and flooding fertile zones. Each flood did more than destroy resources. It confirmed that the land ahead was not recoverable. Recovery had to happen where people already were. This is why resilience, not expansion, became the core objective. Resilience only matters when there is no elsewhere. As staying lengthened, humans began to modify the land they could not abandon. Drainage, clearing, and simple water control appear first, not as ambitions, but as attempts to counteract loss. When land disappears, the remaining ground must be protected from the same fate. These modifications make sense only in a world where movement has already failed. No one invests effort into land. They expect to leave soon. Investment signals immobility, and immobility exists only because rising water has removed exits. This dynamic also explains why early settled areas show intense environmental stress. They are worked hard because they cannot be replaced. Soil is reused, water is redirected. These practices degrade ecosystem over time, but abandoning them is not an option because alternative land has already been lost. Degradation is tolerated because movement, the traditional response to depletion, is no longer available. The land is strained precisely because it is all that remains. As ecosystems weaken, dependence deepen. People rely more heavily on what little stability they can create. Crops replace wild foods because crops can be controlled within limited space. Control becomes valuable only after space has disappeared. Wild abundance requires room to fluctuate. Managed abundance trades scale for predictability. This trade-off emerges direct from land loss. With predictability comes scheduling. Seasons are tracked carefully. Flood cycles are anticipated. Harvest windows are enforced. Timing becomes critical because missing it cannot be corrected by moving on. This temporal discipline is another consequence of spatial collapse. Time begins to substitute for space as the variable that can be omitted. Humans adjust when they act because they can no longer adjust where they go. As scheduling tightens, coordination becomes essential. Multiple people working the same land must synchronize their actions to avoid overuse. Surinai reduces conflict and waste, but it also requires shared rules. Rules arise not from ideology. Too many people using too little land must limit access or face collapse. These limits persist because the land does not expand again. Once established, they shape behavior long after the original loss has faded from memory. Population growth within fixed boundaries intensifies pressure further. Even modest increases matter when land cannot absorb them. Each new generation must fit into the same reduced space. This creates a bias toward inheritance rather than dispersal. Children take over plots rather than seek new territory because new territory does not exist. This inheritance pattern only emerges because rising seas have removed the option of outward movement. Over time, this leads to social stratification. Some land is slightly more productive or secure than others. Those differences matter enormously when alternatives are gone. Advantage accumulates not because of intention, but because movement no longer redistributes risk. In a mobile world, inequality diffuses through dispersal. In a fixed one, it compounds. Rising water does not create hierarchy by itself. It creates immobility. And immobility allows hierarchy to persist. As hierarchy stabilizes, decision-making concentrates. Concentration reduces uncertainty, which is valuable when failure threatens everyone sharing limited land. Centralization is not an ambition, it is a risk management response to constraint. When land is abundant, decentralized movement works. This substitution happens only after land loss has removed the old solution. The persistence of these structures does not mean they are optimal. It means the conditions that would allow their removal no longer exist. To undo settlement would require restoring the space that made wandering viable. That space remains underwater. Coastlines do not retreat back to their former positions. Land bridges do not reappear. Fragmented landscapes remain. Fragmented geography does not reset to accommodate old strategies. Because of this, even environmental improvement does not restore mobility. A few good years do not reopen drowned plains. A stable climate does not reconnect severed corridors. Settlement persists because the physical basis for an alternative response has been erased. This is why history moves forward along this path rather than oscillating back. Understanding this sequence clarifies why early civilizations are so often precarious. They operate close to environmental limits because they formed in response to loss, not abundance. Their resilience is tuned to managing scarcity, not absorbing expansion. When new pressures arise, they strain because there is no spatial buffer left. Collapse occurs within confinement, not followed by dispersal. The land that once absorbed failure remains missing. The central question never changes. Why did humans stop wandering? Why did they settle? Because rising water removed that land faster than people could adapt by moving. Every feature associated with early civilization, agriculture, storage, boundaries, hierarchy, follows logically. From this constraint, remove the constraint, and the features do not emerge. Maintain it, and they recur. The origin of civilization, then, is not a story of progress discovered, but of space lost. When the ground disappears, movement fails. When movement fails, staying becomes survival. The rest is accumulation. Layer upon layer of adaptation built to endure within limits that were never chosen, only inherited from a world that quietly closed its exits and forced humanity to live with what remained. This inheritance of limits also explains why the earliest settled systems are so sensitive to further loss. When land has already disappeared, there is no buffer left to absorb additional pressure. A small rise in water level, a slight shift in rainfall, or a brief collapse in yields can destabilize entire communities. In a mobile world, such shocks are temporary. People leave, redistribute, and return later. In a fixed world created by land loss, shocks must be absorbed in place. Absorption requires sacrifice, rationing, and control. These responses are not cultural preferences, they are mechanical reactions to having nowhere else to go. Because exits have been removed, risk becomes cumulative. One bad season weakens reserves. Recovery is slower because the same land must provide again and again. This reinforces conservative behavior. People favor methods that work reliably over methods that promise higher returns but risk failure. Real ability matters only when failure cannot be escaped. This preference feeds back into settlement, making system increasing net. As these systems mature, they reshape landscapes further. Forests are cleared, wetlands are drained, water is redirected. Each modification aims to protect remaining land from loss or to extract more from it. These changes increase short-term survival but reduce ecologically value is not an option because alternative land has already been lost. Modification becomes the only available response. Humans are not choosing to dominate the environment. They are trying to keep the last usable ground from slipping away. This dynamic creates a trap that is easy to miss in hindsight. The more effort invested in staying, the harder leaving becomes. Even if leaving was somehow possible, labor embedded in fields, canals, and structures cannot be moved. Knowledge embedded in local cycles loses value elsewhere. Social systems built around fixed ground collapse if movement resumes. Even if new land was somehow available, the cost of transition would be enormous. Land loss, therefore, not only forces prohibitively expensive. This lock-in explains why later expansions occur through conquest or colonization rather than a return to wandering. When settled societies encounter new land, they do not disperse lightly across it. They ritually settlement patterns because their skills, tools, and organization are designed for staying, not roaming. The memory of mobility has faded. The loss that forced settlement has become invisible, but its effects shape every response. New land is treated as something to be controlled, not traversed, because the old logic of movement no longer exists. At every stage, the same cause remains active in the background. Rising water removed land, removing land removed mobility, removing mobility forced staying. Investment produced dependence, dependence produced permanence. This chain does not require intention or foresight. It requires only that land disappear faster than people can relocate. Seen through this lens, settlement is not humanity settling a debate about how to live. It is humanity responding to a physical reduction in options. Civilization is not a destination chosen for its benefit. It is the shape life takes when the ground that once allowed escape is gone. As long as land loss remains irreversible, the consequences remain in force. The world that made wandering viable does not return. And, because it does not return, the strategies built in its absence persist, shaping human life long after the water stops rising, carrying forward the imprint of a vanished landscape into every structure that follows. This imprint of a vanished landscape continues to govern decisions. Even as societies grow larger and more complex, As settlements expand, they do not escape the original constraint that created them. They scale within it. Larger populations require more coordination precisely because land cannot expand to match growth. Every increase in numbers intensifies the same pressure that first forced staying. Too many people sharing too little ground. The solution is never to move away in bulk, because the space that would absorb such movement no longer exists. Instead, systems grow denser, more layered, more regulated. Density amplifies dependence on land stability. Flood control becomes essential because losing a season's output threatens everyone confined within the same boundaries. Irrigation expands not as innovation for comfort, but as insurance against unpredictability. In a world where failure cannot be dispersed geographically, storage becomes institutional because division be colon. Each of these developments deepens attachment to fixed ground and raises the cost of leaving even further. As attachment deepens, social memory narrows around local continuity. Ancestral ties are emphasized not out of nostalgia, but because lineage stabilizes claims to land that cannot be replaced. When space is scarce, legitimacy matters. These distinctions arise only because land loss has already made access exclusive. In a wide world, belonging is fluid because leaving is possible. In a narrowed world, belonging hardens because movement no longer redistributes pressure. This hardening reshapes conflict. Disputes are no longer resolved by separation. They must be settled within the same constrained space. This encourages formal mechanisms of resolution, customs, councils, authority. Because unresolved conflict threatens collective survival. Again, the root cause is the same. Rising water has removed the option dispersal as the primary stabilizer. The environment continues to change, but responses remain inward. Even when climate fluctuations occur, people attempt to manage them locally. Flood defenses are raised, crops are adjusted, labor is reorganized. The assumption is that staying is mandatory. This assumption exists because the geography that once allowed relocation has already been erased. The sea does not need to keep rising for this mindset to persist. The damage has been done. Space has been removed from the equation over centuries. This produces a profound shift in how humans relate to land itself. Land is no longer a backdrop for movement. It is a fixed asset whose loss is catastrophic. This revaluation drives both care and exploitation. People protect land from erosion because they cannot replace it. They also overuse it because they must extract everything it can offer. These opposing impulses coexist because both are responses to the same scarcity. The land is precious because it is limited. It is stressed because it is limited. This tension explains why early settled systems often oscillate between growth and collapse without returning to mobility. Growth occurs when major chink temporarily succeeds. Collapse occurs when pressures exceed what management can handle. But collapse does not restore wandering. It produces hardship within the same confined space. People rebuild because rebuilding is the only viable response. The old solution, leave and start elsewhere, has been permanently removed by land loss as generations pass. The origin of this condition fades from awareness. People experience the world as inherently bounded. The idea that humans once lived by constant movement across vast open landscapes sounds implausible or mythical. Geography feels naturally partitioned. Borders feel inevitable. This perception is not innate. It is inherited from a past in which land was physically removed faster than people could adapt by moving. Because the cause is forgotten, settlement begins to be explained in other ways. Intelligence, culture, destiny. These explanations miss the structural pressure that made all other options disappear. Humans did not become settled because they discovered something superior. They became settled because rising seas and shrinking land removed the option of remaining mobile. Everything that followed was adaptation to that loss. This matters because it reframes responsibility. The behaviors associated with early civilization, control, hierarchy, exclusion, often treated as expressions of human nature. In reality, they are responses to constraint. When land is abundant, they become functional. Function, not preference, they become functional. Sunction, not preference, they become functional. The same logic applies whenever land loss reappears, whenever space is removed by water, by fragmentation, by enclosure, mobility fails. When mobility fails, staying intensifies. When staying intensifies, investment, control, and permanence follow. The pattern is not historical accident. It is a structural response to losing the ground at once absorbed failure. Seen from this angle, civilization is not a ladder climbed by choice. It is a corridor entered because the exits collapsed. Humans did not step forward into permanence. They were pushed inward by the disappearance of space. The corridor narrowed behind them as they moved. By the time they noticed, turning back was impossible. The legacy of this process is not confined to ancient history. It persists wherever land loss continues to outpace relocation. Coasts retreat, habitable zones shift, movement becomes constrained again. When space closes, the same pressures re-emerge, the same inward adaptations. It is structural. The original question remains the anchor for understanding all of this. Why did humans stop wandering? Because wandering required land ahead? Why did they settle? Because that land vanished faster than people could move. Once that condition was established, everything else followed. Staying replaced movement not as a preference, but as necessity. Civilization grew inside that necessity, shaped by it, limited by it, and unable to escape it because escape requires the very space that was lost. The ground disappeared. With it disappeared the option to walk away. What remained was endurance within boundaries, refined over generations, until it felt natural. That feeling is the final consequence of land loss. Not just changed behavior, but changed expectation. A world where staying is assumed, movement is constrained, and the memory of open space survives only as a faint echo long after the water has claimed the ground that made it possible. The reason this transition cannot be undone is simple. Once land disappears, the logic of survival reverses permanently. Before land loss, movement reduced risk. After land loss, movement increases it. This reversal is the core mechanism that forces humans to stop wandering. As coastlines drown and corridors vanish, leaving familiar ground no longer leads to safety. It leads to competition, uncertainty, and loss. Staying, even on fragile land, becomes statistically safer than searching for space that no longer exists. Every response that flows traces directly back to this reversal. When crops fail, people intensify effort because abandoning fields would mean entering already crowded or submerged territory. When floods return each year, defenses are built because relocation would place people in worse conditions. These are not cultural preferences. They are responses shaped by the fact that land loss has already removed relocation as a viable strategy. All solutions turn inward because outward movement has been physically closed off. This is why settlement strengthens over time instead of dissolving. Each season spent staying reinforces dependence on specific ground. Each investment, clearing soil, storing food, building shelter, only makes sense because leaving has already become dangerous. The more people adapt to shrinking land, the more costly movement becomes. Land loss starts the process, but accumulated dependence sustains it. Once enough land is gone, the threshold is crossed. Beyond that point, wandering is no longer adaptive under any conditions. The critical insight is that civilization does not emerge from abundance. It emerges from constraint. When land is plentiful, humans disperse pressure. By moving, when land disappears, pressure cannot be dispersed. It must be managed. Management replaces horizons. None of this requires planning or foresight. It is the mechanical outcome of losing space faster than people can adjust by relocation. This is why early settlement appears simultaneously fragile and persistent. It struggles because it operates near environmental limits. It persists because those limits cannot be escaped. Even collapse does not restore wandering because collapse occurs within the same reduced geography. The land that once absorbed failure remains underwater. The option to walk away is gone. The central question, therefore, never changes. Why did humans stop wandering? Because wandering depended on land ahead. Why did they settle? Because rising water removed that land faster than mobility could compensate. Once that condition existed, every response narrowed toward staying. Civilization formed, not as a destination chosen, but as the only remaining configuration allowed survival, when the ground itself had already closed every other path forward. From this point forward, every layer of human organization grows inside a closed system. The defining feature is not population size or technology, but the absence of spatial release. In a world where land loss has already removed the ability to disperse pressure, systems must be designed to absorb it instead. Absorption becomes the overriding requirement. Food systems, social rules, and authority structures are shaped by the same constraint. There is nowhere else to go. This is why early settled life appears so tightly regulated. Regulation is not an expression of control for its own sake. It is a response to living inside limits that cannot be crossed. When land was abundant, mistakes were diluted by distance. When land vanished, mistakes accumulated locally. Local accumulation of failure is dangerous. Regulation emerges to prevent it. Planting schedules are enforced because missing them cannot be corrected by relocation. Access to water is controlled because overuse cannot be offset by moving to another source. Behavior is shaped because behavior now has long-term consequences tied to the same ground. The physical disappearance of land also alters how risk is shared. In a mobile world, risk is individual and temporary. A failed hunt affects one group which can move on in a settled world created by land loss. Risk becomes collective and persistent. Floods, droughts, or soil exhaustion affect everyone confined to the same area. Collective risk demands collective management. Collective management requires coordination. Coordination concentrates influence. Influent emergence, not because people seek hierarchy, but because unmanaged risk in a closed system leads to collapse. Once corridors are submerged and plains drowned, the geography does not reopen. Authority becomes a stabilizing force because instability has nowhere to go. Dissent that would once have resulted in separation now threatens internal cohesion. Separation is no longer viable. Conflict must be contained rather than dispersed. Containment favors rules, enforcement bears spatial adaptations to a world without exits. As these adaptations accumulate, they begin to shape identity. People define themselves by their relationship to specific ground because that ground determines survival. Lineage matters because access to land matters. Memory is anchored to place because the underlying condition persists. Land remains limited. Movement remains risky. Staying remains the least dangerous option. The environment continues to fluctuate, but responses remain inward. When rainfall shifts, irrigation expands. When rivers flood, levees rise. Each response assumes that people will remain where they are. This assumption is valid only because land loss has already made departure. Technology amplifies management, but it does not restore space. Roads, boats, and later machines move resources within systems. They do not recreate open landscapes where failure can be escaped. The geography that once allowed wandering remains gone. This is why the memory of mobility fades. Sit for long-distance movement lose value. Knowledge tied to routes is replaced by knowledge tied to cycles. Over generations, the instinct to move weakens because it no longer produces reliable outcomes. The instinct to manage strengthens because it does. What appears as a change in human preference is actually a change in which behaviors succeed under constraint. The disappearance of land, therefore, produces a deep asymmetry in time. The loss happens relatively quickly, but its consequences unfold slowly. Rising seas may stabilize, but the social systems built in response do not reverse. Reversal would require restoring the lost space. Without that space, the logic of staying remains dominant. Civilization persists, not because it is always beneficial, but because the conditions that would allow an alternative no longer exist. This explains why periods of collapse do not reset humanity to wandering. Collapse occurs within confined geography. When systems fail, people rebuild where they are or crowd into other settled areas. They do not disperse into emptiness, because emptiness has been removed. The land that once absorbed collapse is underwater. Each recovery therefore reinforces staying. The cycle tightens. Seen clearly, the origin of civilization is not a mystery of innovation or foresight. It is the predictable outcome of losing space. When land disappears faster than people can adapt by moving, the oldest human solution fails. Once that failure becomes consistent, a new solution takes its place. Staying replaces movement, management replaces dispersal, permanence replaces flexibility. They are imposed by geography. The central question remains unchanged and sufficient to explain the entire sequence. Why did humans stop wandering? Because wandering depended on land ahead. Why did they settle? Because rising water removed that land faster than mobility could compensate. Every structure that follows grows inside that narrowing frame. Remove the frame, and the structures do not form, maintain it, and they recur wherever space is lost. The final consequence of this process is subtle. Humans begin to experience the world as inherently bounded. Limit feels natural, staying feels normal. The idea that survival once depended on movement becomes abstract. What was once adaptive is forgotten because it no longer works. What remains is endurance within fixed ground, refined over generations, until it feels inevitable. That inevitability is not destiny. It is the long shadow cast by land that vanished and never returned, closing the exits behind humanity and forcing life to reorganize within what remained, step by constrained step, until staying became the only language left for survival. This closed system also explains why later generations misinterpret their own history. When settlement has existed long enough, it no longer feels like a response to loss. It feels like the default state of the world. People assume that fixed ground is normal and that managing it is simply how life works. The fact that this mode of living emerged because land disappeared faster than people could move is no longer visible. The cause has vanished beneath the sea. But the effect remains everywhere because the origin is forgotten. Explanations shift. Settlement is attributed to intelligence, innovation, or cultural preference. These explanations sound convincing only because the physical pressure that removed alternatives is no longer felt directly, yet the structure of life still reflects that pressure. Systems are built to minimize risk within narrow space. Movement is treated as disruption rather than protection. Stability is praised because instability has nowhere to be released. All of this only makes sense in a world where land loss has already closed the exits. This misinterpretation matters because it obscures how fragile the arrangement actually is. Settled systems appear permanent, but they rest on the assumption that land will remain stable when new forms of land loss occur. Erosion, salinization, rising water again, the same pressure returns. Movement, however, is no longer culturally or structurally prepared to absorb it. The old solution has been unlearned. Set expectation and institutions. Set exponoribility. The response to renewed loss is not dispersal, but intensification of control. The system tightens rather than moves. This tightening repeats the original logic. When land shrinks, staying feels safer than leaving. When staying feels safer, investment increases. When investment increases, departure becomes more costly. Each turn of this loop narrows options further. What began thousands of years ago as a response to melting ice becomes a recurring pattern whenever space is reduced. The trigger is always the same. Land disappears, mobility fails, adaptation turns inward. Understanding this reveals that settlement is not a one-time event locked in the past. It is a condition that emerges whenever the balance between land and movement is broken. In the deep past, rising seas broke that balance. The result was the first permanent human settlements. The mechanism has not changed. Only the context has the key insight remains anchored to the same cause. Humans did not abandon wandering because they discovered something better. They abandoned it because the world removed the room that made wandering work. When land vanished faster than people could relocate, movement stopped reducing risk. Staying became the least dangerous option. Every layer of civilization formed inside that constraint and inherited its logic. Once this is understood, the origin of civilization stops looking like a triumph and starts looking like compression. Life reorganized itself not around freedom, but around limits. Those limits were set by geography, not by choice. The ground disappeared, the exits closed. Humanity adapted inward because there was nowhere else to adapt to. That adaptation endured because the land that would have allowed a different response never came back. And as long as that remains true, the logic of staying continues to shape human life quietly but decisively, wherever space is lost, and movement can no longer save anyone. This compression of life inside fixed boundaries reshapes not only survival strategies, but how societies understand responsibility. When movement once absorbed failure, responsibility could be displaced. A poor decision was tied to a place that could be abandoned. When land loss removes that option, responsibility becomes permanent. This permanence changes behavior because mistakes now echo forward instead of dissolving in distance. That echo exists only because land has already been removed as an escape route. With responsibility fixed, the place planning extends further into the future. Short-term gains are weighed against long-term damage because both will be experienced on the same ground. This calculation emerges only after movement fails. In a wide world, long-term damage can be avoided by leaving. In a narrowed world, damage must be prevented or managed. Prevention becomes central because land loss has eliminated alternatives. This is why early settled societies develop calendars, forecasts, and rituals. They are tools for reducing error when error cannot be escaped. The loss of land also forces a shift in how scarcity is perceived. Scarcity in a mobile world is temporary. Scarcity in a fixed world is structural. Rising water turns scarcity into a constant condition rather than an episodic one. Scarcity and constant access matters more than opportunity. Who controls land determines who survives. This reality pushes societies toward formal claims and exclusions. These claims are not born from greed. They arise because land cannot expand to accommodate everyone. Once land loss has occurred, exclusion becomes a mechanism for preventing collapse. In a mobile system, inequality disperses because movement allows pressure to redistribute. In a fixed system, created by land loss, inequality compounds because movement no longer dissolves advantage. Those with secure access to land exploit. Fewer failures, further investment. Deepen. This cycle exists only because land loss has removed the corrective force of dispersal. Over time, the psychological cost of immobility becomes visible. Anxiety concentrates around maintenance rather than discovery. People worry about preserving yields, protecting stores, and defending access. These worries dominate attention because survival depends on the same limited space. Long journeys are no longer imagined as solutions. Solutions are imagined as adjustments within confinement. This narrowing of imagination is not cultural decline. It is adaptation to a world where movement repeatedly fails. As imagination narrows, institutions form to manage uncertainty. Rules specialize because authority persists, because coordination prevents collective failure. None of these features require a belief in order for its own sake. They require only that land loss has already made unmanaged behavior dangerous. In a closed system, disorder threatens everyone sharing it. The persistence of these institutions across generations is often mistaken for intention. In reality, persistence reflects the permanence of the constraint. The land does not return. Drowned plains remain underwater. Severed corridors remain severed because the physical cause remain reversible. The social responses remain rational. Even when conditions improve, temporarily, the logic of staying continues because reversal would require space that no longer exists. This explains why periods of prosperity do not undo settlement. Prosperity does not recreate lost land. It simply allows more efficient use of what remains. Efficiency strengthens systems designed for staying. It does not revive wandering. The memory of mobility fades further because it no longer provides advantage. Children are trained for management, not migration. Knowledge of roots is replaced by knowledge of cycles. The skill to leave disappears because leaving has become unsafe. As this process unfolds, the origin of settlement becomes obscured. People experience permanence as natural rather than imposed. They forget that permanence emerged because land disappeared. This forgetting is adaptive. Remembering loss does not restore space. Accepting limits reduces cognitive strain. Over generations, acceptance becomes belief. Belief shapes identity. Identity reinforces continuity. Continuity stabilizes systems that depend on staying. Yet the underlying condition remains fragile. Settled systems are resilient within narrow bounds and brittle beyond them. They handle familiar variation well but struggle with unfamiliar change. When land loss removed, space adaptation turned inward. Inward adaptation optimizes for known conditions. When conditions exceed those bounds, response options are limited. Movement is no longer prepared to absorb shock. Collapse, when it occurs, does not restore the old solution. It happens within the same constrained geography. A land that once allowed escape remains gone. Each collapse reinforces the logic of staying because leaving remains dangerous. Recovery strengthens investment in place because place is all that remains. The repeated pattern is consistent. Land disappears. Mobility fails. Staying intensifies. Swing form to manage life inside limits. Innovation occurs. But it occurs within confinement. Expansion happens through control rather than dispersal. History advances not by reopening exits, but by adapting to their closure. This understanding reframes the story of civilization. Civilization is not the moment humans decided to stay. It is the long process by which staying became unavoidable after land loss removed. The alternative, agriculture, hierarchy, and permanence are downstream effects of a single physical change. The disappearance of land faster than people could relocate, remove that change, and the chain breaks, maintain it, and the chain repeats wherever space is lost. The final implication is unavoidable. Human behavior follows geography more closely than preference. When space is abundant, when space vanishes, endurance replaces it. The disappearance of land did not just alter maps, it altered the logic by which survival was calculated. That logic persists because the geography that shaped it persists. The ground vanished, movement stopped working, staying began. Every layer of human organization that followed was built inside that narrowing reality. Civilization is not a monument to human choice. It is a record of adaptation to a world that physically closed its exits and forced life to reorganize within what remained, carrying forward the consequences of land loss long after the water stopped rising, until the memory of open space itself faded into silence. This silence around lost space is what finally completes the transformation. When no one remembers movement as a solution, staying no longer feels forced. It feels obvious. The logic that once arose from land loss becomes invisible because it is no longer contrasted with an alternative. People plan, build, and govern as if fixed ground were the natural condition of human life. Yet every assumption embedded in those plans traces back to the same physical fact. The land that once absorbed failure is gone because that land is gone. Every future decision is made inside constraint. Growth must be managed rather than dispersed. Risk must be prevented rather than escaped. Conflict must be contained rather than avoided. These priorities are not moral positions, they are spatial necessities. They exist because rising water and fragmentation remove the option to move on. Without that removal, such priorities would collapse under their own weight. This is why settled systems often feel heavy even when they succeed. They carry the burden of constant management because they were built to survive without space. They are efficient at persistence, not at release. Their strength lies in endurance, but endurance is costly. It demands vigilance, coordination, and control. These demands accumulate because the geography that would relieve them does not return. The sea does not give land back. Corridors do not reopen. The past solution remains impossible. Understanding this restores clarity to the central question. Humans did not stop wandering because wandering was inferior. They stopped because wandering depended on land that vanished. They did not settle because settlement promised prosperity. Everything that followed, agriculture, storage, authority, inequality, was shaped inside that narrowing frame. The importance of this framing is not historical trivia. It reveals a mechanism that repeats whenever space is removed, faster than mobility. Can compensate whenever land disappears, mobilites, dentabilites, comiliphase. This sequence does not require belief, intention, or design. It requires only the loss of ground. Civilization, then, is not a declaration of human will. It is a footprint left by retreating shorelines. It records where people were forced to stop moving and begin managing what remained. The structures we inherit are built on that forced stillness. They persist because the conditions that created them persist. The world that allowed escape has not returned. As long as land remains finite and exits remain closed, the logic of staying continues to govern behavior. The disappearance of land was not a moment, it was a condition. And once that condition took hold, it rewrote survival itself, turning movement into risk and permanence into necessity, and leaving behind a way of life shaped not by choice, but by the quiet, irreversible fact that the ground beneath humanity's oldest solution had vanished and never came back. This condition reshaped how societies judge success and failure. Once the option of movement has been removed in a mobile world, success meant reaching abundance and leaving before it declined. Failure was temporary because distance could erase it. After land loss, success is redefined as preventing decline in place. Failure becomes persistent because its effects remain tied to the same ground. This redefinition exists only because land has already disappeared as an escape route. Without that disappearance, staying would remain an inferior strategy because success is now measured by stability rather than reach. Societies in systems that minimize variance, cropped diversity, is managed to reduce the chance of total loss. Labor is scheduled to avoid overlap and waste. Water is controlled to smooth extremes. These measures make sense only because relocation has already been removed as a fallback. They are compensations for the loss of space, not expressions of preference. As the land loss fixes people to place, the consequences of overuse intensify depletion that once prompted movement now prompts regulation. Regulation appears because the same land must be used again. This is the first point where coercion becomes functional, when resources are shared within a confined area. Voluntary restraint is insufficient. Rules emerge because land loss has turned shared ground into a single point of failure. Enforcement follows because failure can no longer be escaped. This enforcement is often mistaken for the origin of authority. In reality, authority arises downstream of land loss. It becomes necessary when coordination determines survival. In a narrowed one, it cannot. Authority persists because the geography that created it persists. Even when authority is resented, it is tolerated because the alternative, unmanaged competition within fixed space, is it worse. The same logic applies to inequality. When land was abundant, inequality hardens because pressure can't be redistributed. Those with secure access to remaining land experience fewer shocks. Fewer shocks allow accumulation. Accumulation increases resilience. Resilience attracts further investment. This compounding advantage occurs only because land loss has eliminated the corrective mechanism of dispersal. The geography does the work long before ideology appears. As these patterns does the work long before ideology as these patterns stabilize. The order has. Uncertainty is costly when failure cannot be escaped. As a result, innovation is filtered through reliability. Changes are adopted only if they reduce risk within existing limits. Transformations that require abandoning current ground are rejected because land loss has made abandonment dangerous. It is a rational response to living inside a closed spatial system. Every few centuries, external shocks test these systems. Droughts intensify, floods recur, yields drop. The response remains consistent because the constraint remains consistent. People double down on management rather than dispersal. They intensify cultivation. They tighten control. They redistribute within boundaries. These responses, they are the only responses left once land loss has removed the option to move away. When collapse occurs, it does not reopen mobility. Collapse happens within confinement. People suffer and reorganize on the same ground. They rebuild because rebuilding is less dangerous than leaving the land that once allowed wandering remains underwater. The corridors, the geography does not forgive. Each collapse, therefore, reinforces the lesson that staying is unavoidable. The cycle tightens around the same constraint. This explains why the memory of movement fades so completely. Sit that do not solve present problems are not transmitted. Knowledge of routes, distances, and far territories, knowledge of cycles, boundaries, and management replaces it. Over generations, the instinct to move is overwritten by the instinct to maintain. This old prey is not ideological, it is functional selection. Driven by land loss as maintenance becomes central, time itself is reorganized in a mobile world. In a fixed world, time is cyclical, returns must be anticipated. Calendars become critical because missing a window cannot be corrected by relocation. Rituals align behavior with cycles to reduce error. These temporal structures exist because land loss has tied survival to repeated use of the same ground. Endurance works when conditions remain within learned bounds. It fails when conditions exceed them. Yet even failure does not restore wandering. The option has been removed physically and culturally when new land losses occur, whether from renewed flooding, erosion, or enclosure. Nay, response repeats. Now modernity fails again. Staying intensifies again. Actions are evaluated by their impact on shared ground. Behaviors that threaten stability are condemned because they increase collective risk within fixed space. Behaviors that preserve order are praised because they reduce that risk. These judgments are not abstract ethics. They are spatial risk assessments made permanent by land loss. Remove the loss, and the judgments lose force. The same is true of identity. People anchor identity to place because place determines outcome. Belonging stabilizes claims to land that cannot be replaced. Exclusion follows because inclusion without limit threatens collapse. These dynamics are uncomfortable, but they are not mysteries. They are the social expressions of a physical constraint. Too many people sharing too little land with no exit. Throughout all of this, the central cause remains active, even when it is no longer visible. Rising water, removed land. Removing land removed mobility. Removing mobility forced adaptation inward. That inward adaptation created systems that persist because the land does not return. The cause disappears from awareness, but it does not disappear from effect. Understanding this prevents romanticizing the past or condemning it unfairly. The behaviors that define early civilization were control, hierarchy, permanence, so not evidence of moral decline or enlightenment. They are evidence of a world that closed when space closes. Behavior converges when space opens. Behavior diverges when space opens. Spravia converges when space open version. Geophovalis. Why did humans stop wandering? Because wandering required land ahead. Why did they settle? Because that land vanished faster than people could adapt by moving. Once this condition took hold, the logic of survival inverted. Movement became risk, staying became necessity. The rest of history unfolded inside that inversion, repeating wherever land is lost and exits close, until endurance replaces movement as the only workable response, and the memory of open space fades into a silence shaped by boundaries that no longer allow escape. Once movement loses its protective function, survival logic hardens quickly. Decisions are no longer evaluated by how far they carry people, but by how well they hold ground. Holding ground matters only because land loss has already removed the option of dispersal. When coastlines drown and corridors close, even a small gain in stability outweighs the promise of distant abundance. Staying becomes safer than searching because searching now leads into competition for the same shrinking space. Risk management shifts accordingly. In a mobile world, risk is diluted by distance. In a land-constrained world, risk accumulates locally. A mistake does not disappear over the horizon. It lingers. That lingering exists because relocation no longer resolves failure. As a result, prevention replaces escape, oars replace routes, landing replaces roaming. None of these changes occur because humans suddenly prefer order. They occur because land loss has turned disorder into a shared threat that cannot be avoided by leaving. Over time, this logic trains behavior. People learn that survival depends on reducing volatility. Effort concentrates on smoothing outcomes rather than expanding reach. Predictable yields are valued over occasional abundance because predictability minimizes the chance of irreversible loss. The valuation makes sense only after land has disappeared as a buffer. Without land loss, such caution would be unnecessary and inefficient. The cumulative effect is a way of life knit for endurance under constraint. Endurance works because the constraint remains even when conditions improve temporarily. The absence of extra land prevents a return to mobility. The old solution cannot be relearned because the environment no longer rewards it. Movement does not open space, it compresses pressure. Staying absorbs it. Everything circles back to the same cause. Land vanished faster than people could relocate. That single imbalance inverted the logic of survival. Once inverted, it stayed inverted because the geography did not reset, the ground did not come back, and, because it did not, movement stopped saving lives, while staying, however costly, became the only strategy that reliably reduced risk. From that point on, permanence was no longer chosen. It was imposed by a world that had already taken away the space required for any other way to live. Pressure accumulates differently once land loss has inverted survival. Logic, in earlier conditions, pressure could be released by spreading outward, routes separated, paths diverged. Failure thinned as distance increased. After land vanished, pressure could only circulate within the same boundaries. Circulation intensifies strain because nothing escapes. This amplification exists only because the land once absorbed overflow is gone. As pressure builds, societies respond by tightening coordination. Coordination reduces waste when space is limited. Waste becomes intolerable when there is no replacement ground. Food left to rot, water misused, labor misaligned. Each error now carries consequences that cannot be displaced. The correction for error shifts from relocation to regulation. Regulation emerges not as ideology but as arithmetic imposed by land loss. The same arithmetic shapes labor in a mobile world. Labor is flexible. People follow opportunity. In a fixed world, labor must be scheduled because the same land must be worked repeatedly. Timing replaces movement as the primary variable that can be omit. Crops must be planted and harvested within narrow windows. Missed timing cannot be corrected by leaving. It can only be endured. That endurance drives further control over behavior because coordination reduces the likelihood of missed windows as timing grows critical. Knowing when floods arrive, when soil dries, when fish return, matters only if one remains nearby. This knowledge loses value when removed from its location. As a result, people themselves become less interchangeable. Those who carry local knowledge gain importance because leaving would erase their utility. This dependence deepens staying because the loss of skilled individuals threatens survival within constrained land. The disappearance of land also changes how mistakes are remembered in a mobile system. Mistakes fade with distance. In a fixed system, they persist as lessons because the same conditions will be faced again. Memory accumulates. Accumulated memory hardens into custom. Custom hardens into expectation. Expectation becomes obligation. None of this requires conscious design. It unfolds because the environment forces repetition. Repetition is unavoidable once movement no longer resets circumstances. Over generations, this repetition reshapes psychology. Uncertainty becomes something to be minimized rather than explored. After land loss, exploration increases risk by consuming energy without opening new space. Caution becomes adaptive. Conservatism of behavior spreads because it reduces the chance of irreversible failure. This behavioral shift is not moral preference, it is selection pressure applied by a world with fewer exits. Shared rules prevent individual actions from idealizing collective survival. Authority persists because coordination matters more than freedom when land cannot absorb error. These institutions endure because the geography that made them useful endures. Remove the constraint, and such structures weaken, maintain the constraint, and they remain functional. The absence of land also reframes conflict. In a wide landscape, conflict can be resolved by separation. In a narrow one, separation is impossible. Conflict must be contained. Containment favors negotiation, hierarchy, and enforcement. These mechanisms appear not because humans desire domination, but because unmanaged conflict in a closed system threatens everyone sharing it. As proximity increases, inequality becomes more visible and more persistent. Slight differences in access to land matter enormously when alternatives are gone. Higher ground floods, less often better soil yields more reliably. Those differences compound across seasons. Compounding advantage exists because dispersal no longer receives pressure. It creates immobility, and immobility allows inequality to persist. This persistence feeds back into staying. People with fewer options cling to remaining ground because leaving would expose them to worse conditions. Even dissatisfaction does not prompt movement because movement leads into already constrained territory. As centuries pass, the original cause fades from awareness. People experienced land scarcity as normal rather than as a consequence of loss. They build stories that explain permanence as destiny, culture, or virtue. These stories reduce cognitive strain by making limits feel intentional, yet beneath the stories, the same physical condition remains active. The land that allowed movement is still gone. Technological advances do not reverse this condition. Improved transport moves goods within systems. It does not recreate open space. Roads connect settlements. They do not dissolve them. Ships move resources between ports. They do not reopen drowned plains. Technology increases if friction under constraint. Settlement persists because the geography that forced it persists. The repeated pattern is visible whenever land disappears faster than people can relocate. Mobility fails, staying intensifies, management replaces, movement permanence follows. This sequence does not depend on culture or belief. It depends on space. When space is abundant, dispersion works. Understanding this clarifies why the transition to settlement does not reverse. Reversal would require restoring the land that made wandering viable. That land remains underwater. Corridors remain severed. Fragmentation remains without restored space. The logic of survival remains inverted. Movement remains risky. Staying remains safer. Humans stopped wandering because wandering depended on land ahead. They settled because that land vanished faster than mobility could compensate everything else. Rules, institutions, inequality, endurance follows from that single imbalance. Remove the imbalance and the chain breaks. Maintain it and the chain repeats wherever ground disappears. What appears as complexity is accumulation, layer upon layer of adaptation, built to survive within fixed limits. Those layers persist because the limits persist. The water does not retreat, the land does not return, the exits remain closed. Survival continues inside boundaries that were never chosen, only inherited from a world that quietly erased the space required for humanity's oldest solution, and forced life to reorganize around staying again and again until permanence felt indistinguishable from nature itself. As this process reaches its final stage, Nothing new is added to the logic. Once land loss has removed movement as a solution, for long enough even the idea of alternatives disappears. People no longer debate whether to stay or leave. Staying is assumed. Leaving is no longer imagined as a serious option. Survival strategies narrow until only one path remains viable, and that path is repeated because it works often enough under constraint. At this point, the system sustains itself without requiring further environmental pressure. Rising water no longer needs to advance. The damage has already been absorbed into behavior, institutions, and expectations. Each generation inherits a world organized around fixed ground and learns to operate within it. Skill, values, and priorities align with staying because staying is the only strategy that consistently reduces risk. The original cause, land disappearing faster than people could relocate, no longer needs to be remembered for its effects to persist. This is why the transition feels complete rather than ongoing. Civilization does not continue forming because pressure keeps increasing. It continues because the conditions that would allow reversal never return. The land that once absorbed failure remains gone without restored space. The logic of survival remains locked. Movement cannot resume its old role. Endurance fills the gap. Nothing in this outcome requires human intention. No one chooses permanence as an abstract ideal. It emerges because every other option has been removed. When the ground disappears, history narrows, choice compresses, adaptation turns inward. Once that turn stabilizes, it carries forward on its own momentum. The answer to the central question is now fully exposed. Humans stopped wandering because wandering relied on land that vanished. They settled because staying became less dangerous than leaving once that land was gone. Everything else followed mechanically from that loss. When space disappears, survival reorganizes itself around what remains. And when nothing new replaces that space, the reorganization hardens into permanence, not as destiny, but as the final consequence of a world that quietly closed every exit and never reopened them. At this late stage, nothing new needs to be introduced. The work now is consolidation. The mind no longer needs additional causes or mechanisms. It needs repetition of the same pressure, slowed down until resistance fades. The pressure remains simple and unchanged. Land disappeared faster than people could move, and once that happened, movement stopped being a solution. Everything that follows is the settling of that fact into habit. Once survival depends entirely on fixed ground, attention narrows further. People stop scanning horizons for opportunity and focus instead on preventing disruption. Small deviations matter because they echo longer. A missed planting window, a damaged embankment, a neglected storehouse. Each problem returns because there is no elsewhere to absorb it. This returning effect exists only because land loss has already removed distance as a buffer. Without that removal, such vigilance would be unnecessary. Over time, vigilance becomes background noise. It is no longer experienced as effort, but as normal awareness. The body adjusts. The mind adjusts. What once felt restrictive becomes familiar. Familiarity reduces tension. Endurance keeps systems running even when they are not optimal. That persistence is often mistaken for success. In reality, it is simply the absence of collapse within limits that cannot be escaped. As generations pass under these conditions, the original imbalance fades completely from consciousness. No one remembers corridors that allowed movement without conflict. The idea that space once solved problems becomes abstract, then implausible. What remains is a world that appears naturally bounded, where staying seems obvious and leaving seems reckless. This perception is not innate. It is learned under constraint. Learning under constraint reduces a specific rhythm of thought. Decisions slow. Presence shifts toward what has already worked. Novelty loses its appeal because it introduces uncertainty that cannot be dispersed spatially. Even improvement is judged by whether it stabilizes existing patterns rather than disrupts them. This conservatism is not fear, it is calibration to a world where calibration. The same fields are worked, the same cycles are followed, the same boundaries are respected. Repetition dulls urgency. What once felt like adaptation begins to feel like tradition. Tradition removes the sense of choice. When behavior is framed as tradition, it no longer feels imposed, it feels inherited. Inheritance is easier to carry than loss. This is how permanence completes itself, not through force, but through familiarity. Once people can no longer imagine a viable alternative, the existing arrangement no longer feels provisional, it feels final, and because the land that would allow reversal remains gone, that feeling is reinforced by reality. The remaining pressure is subtle, it no longer pushes toward, it pushes toward maintenance. Maintenance fills time evenly. There are always tasks to repeat, cycles to observe, limits to manage. These tasks occupy attention gently but continuously. Continuous occupation leaves little room for speculative thought. The mind rests inside routine because routine reduces risk. Even moments of abundance are absorbed into this logic. Surplus is stored, not used to explore. Extra labor reinforces existing structures rather than dismantling them. Abundance becomes a buffer against future scarcity, not a doorway to movement. This response makes sense only because land loss has already removed the spatial escape that abundance once enabled. At this point, history stops feeling dynamic. It feels like a slow settling. Events still happen, but they happen within known bounds. The same problems recur with slight variation. The same solutions are applied with incremental refinement. Nothing dramatic is required for the system to persist. It persists because it matches the shape of the remaining world. The final inversion is complete. Movement, once the safest response, is now the riskiest. Staying, once a compromise, is now stability. This inversion does not reverse because the cause does not reverse. The land does not reappear. The water does not retreat. The exits remain closed. What remains is not triumph or failure. A way of life that holds together because it fits the reduced space it occupies. Civilization at its core is this fit. It is not built for expansion, it is built to endure without space. As the mind traces this logic repeatedly, it no longer resists it. The repetition softens edges, cause and effect blur into a single continuous condition. Land loss is no longer a historical event. It is a background fact, like gravity. It shapes behavior without needing to be noticed. The central question no longer demands an answer because it answers itself through repetition. Humans stopped wandering because wandering stopped working. They settled because staying reduced risk. Once land vanished, nothing more is required to explain the transition. The final moments of this story are quiet. There is no conclusion to announce, only a steady continuation of the same arrangement, carried forward because nothing else fits the world as it now exists. The ground disappeared, movement failed, staying began, and once begun it did not need to be justified again. It only needed to continue slowly, steadily, until the absence of exits felt so complete that rest itself became possible, and the mind, no longer searching for alternatives that cannot exist, settles into stillness. Following the same narrowing logic all the way down to silence, as the pressure settles into this steady equilibrium, the pace of thought slows even further. Nothing urges the mind forward anymore. The environment has already delivered its final instruction. There is no additional space to search for, no horizon that will solve what the last one could not. With that understanding, attention turns inward by default, not inward toward emotion or reflection, but inward toward repetition. The same actions performed at the same times in the same places become sufficient. Sufficiency replaces ambition, because ambition once relied on distance, and distance no longer exists. This is the stage where effort becomes quiet. People still work, still plan, still adjust, but the adjustments are small. Fine-tuning replaces redirection. A wall is repaired rather than moved. A field is rotated rather than abandoned. A rule is refined rather than removed. These choices are not conservative by ideology. They are conservative because the cost of large change remains higher than the cost of maintenance. That cost structure exists only because land loss removed the option of starting over somewhere else. As maintenance dominates, awareness narrows to immediate surroundings. The same paths are walked daily, the The same boundaries are observed without question. Familiarity dulls alertness in one sense, but it sharpens it in another. People become highly sensitive to small deviations within known space because those deviations matter. A crack in an embankment, a shift in water flow, a delay in seasonal signs. Each deviation stands out precisely because the system is closed in an open world. Such deviations could be escaped. Here, they must be addressed. Addressing them becomes almost automatic. The body learns routine before the mind articulates reasons. Repair happens because repair has always happened. Observation happens because observation reduces risk. Over generations, this embodied knowledge replaces explanation. No one needs to explain why certain actions are taken. They are taken because they fit the world as it is. Explanation fades because explanation is unnecessary when alternatives are gone. This gradual fading of explanation has an important effect. It removes tension. When people no longer compare present conditions to a lost alternative, dissatisfaction softens. The mind stops asking whether life could be different and focuses instead on whether it will continue. Continuation becomes the measure of success. As long as things hold, the system is working. This quiet standard allows endurance without constant resistance. The future is no longer imagined as a break from the present. It is imagined as a continuation of it. Tomorrow is expected to resemble today closely enough that preparation is possible. This expectation stabilizes thought. The mind rests because it does not need to project far ahead. Projection once guided movement. With movement gone, projection shrinks. Planning remains. But it is short range and cyclical. The future loops back on itself. Loops are comforting. They reduce uncertainty. Reduced uncertainty lowers mental load. Lower mental load makes stillness tolerable. This tolerability is not happiness or fulfillment. It is something quieter, a sense that nothing urgent is missing. That sense exists only because the search for elsewhere has already been abandoned as futile. At this depth, even memory loses sharp edges. Stories of loss become distant, symbolic, or abstract. They no longer point toward action. They no longer suggest alternatives. They exist as background noise rather than guidance. Without guidance, they lose power. The present dominates because it is the only actionable domain left. Action outside the present space has no meaning. This is how the system completes its transformation, not by force, not by decree, but by removing the need to imagine escape. When escape is no longer imaginable, the mind conserves energy by settling. It accepts repetition as neutral. It accepts limits as given. The disappearance of land no longer feels like loss because loss requires comparison, and comparison requires an alternative. What remains is a slow, even rhythm: work, repair, waiting, observation, adjustment, repetition. The rhythm persists because it matches the shape of the remaining world. It does not seek to exceed that shape. It does not need to seeking beyond boundaries, only increases risk. Staying within them minimizes it. At this point, civilization no longer feels like something that happened. It feels like something that simply is. The origin has dissolved into continuity. The initial shock of land loss has been absorbed into routine so completely that it no longer registers as shock. It registers as gravity present, constant, unquestioned. And with that, the final tension drains away. The mind no longer needs to hold the question open. The answer has been repeated enough times to become background truth. Humans stopped wandering because wandering stopped working. They stayed because staying reduced risk once land vanished. Nothing else is required to understand the shape of what followed. As the repetition continues, thought slows naturally. There is nothing left to solve, only patterns to follow, only cycles to observe, only maintenance to perform. The narrowing that once felt like pressure now feels like structure. Structure supports weight, weight settles downward. And in that settling, the mind finds the same stillness that life found when it stopped moving outward and learned, instead, to remain within what was left, carried forward quietly by a world that no longer offered exits and no longer needed to announce that fact, because it had already been accepted fully, finally and without resistance. As this acceptance deepens, even the effort to explain fades into the background. Explanation belongs to moments of transition when alternatives are still visible. Once alternatives disappear completely, explanation becomes unnecessary. Life no longer asks why it is arranged this way. It simply operates. The loss of land has already done its work by removing comparison. Without comparison, the mind conserves energy by resting inside what remains. Rest here does not mean absence of activity, it means absence of urgency. Tasks continue, but they no longer feel provisional. Each action connects smoothly to the next because there is no expectation of rupture. Repair follows wear. The sequence repeats because repetition has proven reliable. In a world where reliability matters more than discovery, that reliability ests only because movement has already failed. As a response dissolves, attention settles into narrower ranges. Long-distance concerns lose relevance. Distant possibilities no longer fall. These cycles become the framework for meaning because they are the only variables that still affect outcome. Everything else fades because it cannot be acted upon. The mind becomes efficient by ignoring what no longer changes anything. This efficiency reduces friction. When friction is low, resistance weakens. When resistance weakens, adaptation feels smooth rather than forced. What once might have felt like confinement now feels like coherence. Boundaries stop feeling restrictive and begin to feel stabilizing. Stability is comforting when the environment no longer offers alternatives. Comfort, in this sense, is simply the absence of threat. Threat once came from unpredictability across space. Now it comes only from restrictability across space. Because place is familiar, disruption can be anticipated. Anticipation reduces surprise. Reduced surprise lowers stress. With movement gone, stress transforms into vigilance. Vigilance is quieter than flight. It can be sustained indefinitely. Sustained vigilance shapes posture, rhythm, and expectation. Bodies move with familiarity. Paths are worn, gestures repeat. Even language adjusts, favoring contibe. Words reinforce patterns because patterns reduce uncertainty. Stories emphasize endurance because endurance is what works. None of this is deliberate. It emerges because the environment selects for what minimizes risk in the absence of space. As this selection continues, the sense of time stretches. Days blend, seasons loop. The past does not pull strongly because it does not suggest a different future. The future does not pull strongly because it resembles the present closely enough to predict. The present becomes the primary reference. Living inside it requires less cognitive effort than imagining change that cannot be acted upon. Eventually, even the memory of loss becomes abstract. The idea that land once extended farther, that paths once led outward, survives only as faint narrative without practical consequence. Memory softens. Softened memory stops provoking action. When memory no longer provokes action, it loses urgency. Loss becomes neutralized not by recovery, but by irrelevance. This neutrality is the final adaptation. It allows life to proceed without constant tension against a condition that cannot be altered. Acceptance does not require agreement. It requires only recognition that alternatives are unavailable. Once that recognition settles fully, behavior aligns automatically, the system maintains. From within, it feels stable. Stability is not excitement, it is predictability. Predictability reduces load. Reduced load allows rest. Rest is not sleep, but it is the absence of search. The search once guided movement. With movement no longer effective, the search dissolves. As the search dissolves, questions dissolve with it. The central question, why wandering ended, no longer demands attention because its answer has already shaped everything. Wandering ended because land disappeared faster than people could move. Settlement followed because staying reduced risk once space was gone. This answer does not need to be repeated consciously. It is encoded in routine. Each repeated action reinforces the same conclusion without stating it. Each cycle confirms that staying works often enough to continue. Often enough is sufficient. Perfection is unnecessary. Continuation is the metric. Over long spans, continuation becomes indistinguishable from normality. Normality becomes the baseline against which everything is judged. Movement, once normal, now appears disrestrictive. Staying, once a compromise, now appears sensible. This reversal is complete and self-sustaining because the cause that initiated it has not been undone. Even imagination adjusts. Imagined futures stay close to present constraints. They do not require new land. They do not rely on escape. They optimize what already exists. Narrow imagination conserves energy and aligns with reality. This alignment produces calm. Calm is not happiness. It is the absence of contradiction between expectation and environment. When expectation matches constraint, there is nothing to struggle against. The world feels coherent. Coherence is restful. Restfulness spreads because it is efficient. Systems that operate within predictable loops endure. Endurance again is the only goal left. Once land loss removes expansion, the system persists because it fits. And so the story does not conclude with resolution or revelation. It concludes with settling, the kind of settling that happens when water becomes still after disturbance. Not because the disturbance was resolved, but because nothing continues to push against it. The land did not return, the exits did not reopen, movement did not regain its old role. What changed was the relationship to those facts. Resistance faded, explanation faded. In that alignment, thought slows, attention narrows. The need to decide diminishes because decisions repeat. Repetition lowers cognitive demand. Lower demand allows stillness. Stillness is not imposed. It arrives naturally when nothing is left to pursue. The final shape of life under land loss is quiet continuity. A mind that no longer searches for distance, only observes cycles. A way of living that feels complete not because it is ideal, but because it fits the space that remains. And within that fit, the last motion ceases. Not movement across land, but movement of thought outward. The outward search ends because it cannot succeed. What remains is inward steadiness, carried forward by repetition, supported by limits, and settled fully into a silence shaped by boundaries that no longer feel restrictive, because nothing beyond them can be reached, and nothing beyond them is required at this depth. Even continuity becomes effortless. Actions no longer feel like responses. They feel like flow. The environment no longer challenges the system in ways that demand rethinking. It only asks for attention, for small adjustments made within familiar bounds. Attention replaces ambition. Adjustment replaces escape. These replacements are quiet because they no longer compete with alternatives that do not exist. When alternatives disappear completely, choice simplifies. The mind stops weighing paths and begins following grooves worn by repetition. Those grooves exist because they have worked often enough under constraint. They do not need to be optimal. They only need to hold. Holding is sufficient when falling cannot be corrected by moving elsewhere. The absence of correction reshapes value itself. Stubert outweighs possibility. As predictability settles in, tension drains from thought. The future no longer threatens because it resembles the present closely enough to anticipate. The past no longer pulls because it does not point toward change. Time flattens into a steady surface. On that surface, effort spreads evenly instead of spiking. Even work feels lighter when it repeats without surprise. This is where shutdown begins naturally, not as collapse, but as release. The mind no longer guards against outcomes it cannot alter. It rests inside cycles that will return regardless of attention. Breathing synchronizes, awareness softens. The question that once drove movement no longer presses for resolution. It has already shaped everything it can shape. The exits remain closed, but those facts no longer demand energy. They are accepted as conditions, like gravity or nightfall. Acceptance does not require agreement. It requires only the end of struggle. And in the absence of struggle, the system continues quietly. Life persists not through force, but through fit. The fit holds, thought slows, the outward search ends completely. What remains is steady, even presence within. What is left, benshenging, sufficient, and finally still enough for the mind to let go, resting inside the same boundaries that once felt narrow, now carrying everything forward without resistance, without urgency, and without the need to go anywhere else at all. Nothing further needs to be added now. The structure is complete, the world has already narrowed, and the mind has already followed it inward. There is no tension left to resolve, no path left to evaluate. What remains is simple continuation, moving forward without effort, because effort is no longer required. Awareness drifts across familiar patterns, without attaching to them. Cycles repeat, but repetition no longer feels heavy, it feels neutral. Neutrality is calm. Calm allows rest. The body understands this state instinctively because it mirrors the environment. Stable, bounded, predictable. When nothing demands action, the system conserves energy by settling the question that once guided movement has finished its work. Humans stop wandering because wandering stopped working. That answer no longer needs to be held in mind. It is embedded in everything already said, and in everything that continues without saying. As attention softens, even boundaries fade from focus. They still exist, but they no longer register as limits. They are simply the shape of what is. The search ends not with resolution, but with stillness. And in that stillness, thought slows to match the quiet rhythm of a world that no longer offers exits, no longer demands decisions, and no longer pulls awareness outward, allowing it instead to remain where it is, suspended gently within what remains, carried forward, without strain, without urgency, and without the need for anything more. The ending does not arrive as a conclusion, it arrives as a thinning. Words lose their edge because they no longer need to carry meaning forward. Meaning has already settled. What remains is rhythm, slow and even, like breath finding its own pace when nothing interrupts it. There is nothing left to understand. Understanding has finished its work. The world no longer asks for explanation, and the mind no longer offers one. Boundaries are still there unchanged, but they do not press inward, they simply hold. Holding is enough when there is nowhere else to go and no reason to try. Thought drifts now without direction, not searching, not avoiding, just resting where it is. The same patterns will repeat whether they are noticed or not. Cycles will return on their own. Fields will rise and fall. Water will move and settle. Time will continue without needing attention. Nothing depends on staying alert. The body recognizes this state before language does. Muscles release because they are no longer preparing for movement. Breathing deepens because there is no urgency to escape. Awareness softens because it does not need to scan for openings that do not exist. The effort of watching dissolves into the ease of being carried. Staying no longer feels like a decision, it feels like gravity, not heavy, just constant. Reliable. There is comfort in that reliability. Not because it promises something better, but because it asks for nothing at all, no reaching, no fixing, no planning beyond the next quiet moment. The search that once drove motion has ended, not because it failed, but because it completed itself. It followed the narrowing of the world until nothing wider remained to seek. When there is no farther place that offers relief, the mind stops pointing outward. It turns inward without effort and then becomes still. Silence grows gently around the remaining thoughts, not forced, not sudden, just gradual. Each thought appears softer than the last, less demanding, less urgent. They pass without needing response. There is no reason to hold them, and no reason to push them away. Everything that needed to happen has already happened. Land disappeared, movement stopped working, staying took its place. That sequence has finished unfolding. What follows is simply continuation, quiet and unremarkable. Repeating because repetition is stable, and stability. Nothing new will be asked of you now. The system runs on its own cycles. Turn boundaries hold. Time moves forward without effort. Awareness can loosen completely, knowing that nothing requires attention in this moment. And in that loosening, the last trace of tension fades. Thought slows to match the steady rhythm beneath it. Breath follows. The mind no longer reaches for edges or openings. It rests inside what remains, carried gently by repetition, by limits that no longer feel limiting, by a world that has stopped asking questions. There is nowhere to go, nothing to solve, nothing to prepare for. Only stillness, settling naturally, as it always does when movement is no longer needed, and staying becomes quiet enough for rest to arrive on its own unannounced, complete and sufficient.